Elliot Graves didn't remember checking into Briarwood Memorial Hospital, nor did he recall being wheeled in, assigned a room, or signing a single form. And yet, when he opened his eyes, he found himself in a narrow bed with railings on both sides, tucked beneath a grayish-white blanket that smelled faintly of antiseptic and something else, older, like old paper or the inside of a library book forgotten in a basement. And as his mind began to settle into the gentle fog of unfamiliarity, he looked around the small room marked only as room 139 on a small silver plate outside the door, a room that seemed deliberately plain, with white walls, a tiled floor that bore no shine, and a single overbed lamp hanging from a thin cord in the ceiling, flickering faintly with a soft rhythm that matched neither his breathing nor his heartbeat. There were no machines hooked to him, no wires, no IV drips, only the bed, a steel-framed nightstand with no drawers, and a chair in the corner that looked like no one had sat in it for years. The clock on the wall had no hands, the window on the far side was painted shut, its glass clouded over like an old mirror. Outside, he could see no light, no sky, just a faint haze as if the hospital were floating in mist, cut off from any world he had ever known. He sat up slowly, not because he had to, but because it felt expected, as if he were playing a role he hadn't been told about. On the nightstand was a file folder with his name printed in block letters. Grades, oligot, observation. Inside were pages of notes, but the handwriting was faint, scribbled, sometimes illegible, and much of it had been redacted with thick black marker. Words like incident, prior facility, and secondary screening stood out among the noise. He turned each page with a growing sense of disconnection. Not fear, not confusion, just a dull acceptance, as if his presence here was not something to question, but something that had already been answered. He tried the door. It opened, but not easily, its hinges creaking in a slow, syrupy way, and beyond it, the hallway was dimly lit with old fluorescent bulbs buzzing overhead, casting a pale green light that made the peeling walls look wet, though they were dry to the touch. The floors were tiled in that outdated hospital beige, speckled with darker dots that seemed to shift if you stared too long. There was no sound, no beeping monitors, no paging system, no footsteps, only the deep, oppressive quiet that made the building feel like it was asleep, with its eyes open. He walked slowly, barefoot, each step echoing more than it should have, and every few yards he passed rooms with closed doors and frosted glass, behind which faint shadows moved, too slow and too smooth to be human, though none of them ever seemed to notice him. At the nurses' station, there were no nurses, just an old CRT monitor, still glowing faintly with a login screen that blinked every few seconds. User ID, unattended. A telephone sat beside it, off the hook but silent. On the counter was a list of room numbers, but most of them had been crossed out with thick red ink, and others had been erased entirely. Room 139, his room, was circled in pencil, with one word next to it: reprocessing. Elliot said nothing. He didn't feel alarmed. He didn't feel anything. He moved like someone walking through a dream they weren't fully part of. As he turned the corner toward the west wing, the lights began to flicker in a new pattern. 2 quick pulses, then darkness, then a longer glow, over and over again, leading him towards something he didn't recognize but didn't resist. The west wing was colder, or maybe the silence here simply felt heavier. On the far wall, a large bulletin board displayed patient safety protocols from 2 decades ago. One paper listed evacuation procedures, but the map had no arrows, only concentric circles, drawn in pen over and over again until the paper had worn thin in the center. A janitor's cart sat abandoned near the fire exit, stocked with supplies still in their plastic packaging, never used, never touched. He entered the nearest room, room 142. Inside, the furniture was identical to his own, but everything was turned upside down. The bed on its headboard, the chair against the ceiling, the lamp hanging upward. A thick white tape crossed the floor with the word "observed" stamped repeatedly across it in faded red ink. On the wall, scratched faintly into the plaster, was a single line of text. Rooms rearrange themselves when no one's watching. Elliot backed out slowly. The hallway had grown longer while he was inside, extending past where the nurse's station had once been, and the numbers on the doors no longer followed any pattern. 138, then 222, then 3, then simply a blank silver plate. He turned around. His room was gone. In its place stood a maintenance closet, door ajar, revealing nothing but darkness and a ladder leading downward into the floor. As he looked, a light from below blinked once, then again. Without knowing why, he turned and walked away. The hallway welcomed him, adjusted to his pace, stretched itself in his direction. He passed a room that smelled of cinnamon and old wood, though there was no source, no scent diffusers, just memory echoing from walls too old to forget. A mural of the hospital's founding board of directors had been painted on one wall, but each of their faces had been scrubbed out, leaving only their suits and nameplates. Dr. Lionel Kessler, Sister Agatha Dorn, Director E. Graves. That last name stopped him, the initials E. Graves, but there was no photo, no context, just the suggestion of presence. Was that him? Or someone else? A coincidence? He stared until the letters blurred. Behind him, the hallway lights flickered off one by one, like closing eyelids. Ahead, room 139 reappeared, not where it was, but waiting. The door creaked open without touch. Inside, the bed was made, the file folder was gone, the chair now faced the bed directly, and sitting in it was a figure wearing hospital whites, hands folded, face shadowed. It didn't speak, didn't move. Elliot stepped in slowly. The door closed behind him with no sound. The lights dimmed, and for a long time there was only silence. Then the intercom above the bed clicked once. A soft voice, calm, clinical, ageless, spoke gently. Patient Graves. Status, ongoing. Then silence again. The figure across from him smiled, or maybe it didn't. Maybe it was just the shadows shifting. He thought, don't move. And once again, the patient paged. The shadows, maybe none of it had begun. Maybe this was still the check-in. The night settled deeper over the broken roof of Briarwood Memorial Hospital, and in the hollow quiet of room 209, Elliot Graves lay awake, eyes wide open but unmoving, watching the ceiling with the stillness of someone who had either forgotten to blink or simply didn't need to anymore. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, like damp cotton wrapped around sound itself. The soft hum of the overhead light flickered out 3 hours ago, and yet Elliot hadn't moved since, not even once. He didn't remember falling asleep, he didn't remember waking up. All he knew was that he was here, in a room, with no calendar, no clock, no window, and only the gentle tap of water leaking from somewhere behind the walls, repeating with a rhythm that didn't match anything human. Somewhere far down the hallway, a service trolley rolled slowly, as if pushed by no one in particular, its wheels whispering over cracked linoleum. Elliot finally sat up, not because he wanted to, but because it felt like something somewhere had requested it. Wordlessly, invisibly, but undeniably. His feet touched the cold tile floor, and he noticed for the first time that his shoes were missing. So were his socks. In fact, he had no memory of taking them off. They simply weren't there. The file on the bedside table was gone too, replaced with a small black tape recorder that hadn't been there the night before. It clicked on by itself the moment he looked at it. The voice that came through was tired, gravelly, and strangely familiar, though he couldn't say why. Elliot Graves, Ward 2B observation list. Status, incomplete processing. Please report to Nurses Station B. That was all. No beep, no static, just the voice, and then silence again. He waited, thinking perhaps the voice would repeat itself, but it didn't. Instead, the lights in the hallway turned on, one by one, not all at once, but slowly, like an invitation spelled out in flickering Morse code. Elliot stepped out of room 29 with bare feet, expecting the floor to be cold, but instead it was oddly warm, like it had been recently used. The hallway ahead of him stretched further than it should have, longer than he remembered, and curved ever so slightly to the left, making the end of it invisible no matter how far he looked. In the distance, something wisped through the lights, followed by a loud, dull thud, as if no light had ever been there in the first place. As he passed room 213, he glanced at the frosted glass and saw movement behind it, just a shadow pacing back and forth. No sound, no footsteps, just movement, and then it stopped. Not in the natural way a person would stop pacing, but like a puppet whose strings were suddenly cut. Elliot looked away quickly. Something told him not to look again. He reached the nurse's station after what felt like 20 minutes, though the hallway had only 3 doors and no turn. The station was unstaffed, abandoned like everything else in the building, but a single green light on the old rotary intercom buzzed softly, blinking. He touched the button. "Hello?" he said, his voice sounding too loud in the silent space. No response. Then the static began. Not the kind you'd expect, no harsh crackling or sudden pops, but a slow, rolling wave of static, as if a distant shore was breathing through the wire. And then a voice not the same as the first. This one was feminine, polite, clinical, like an old automated message left to run forever. "Mr. Graves, you are currently located in an unauthorized wing. Your file indicates incomplete evaluation. Please proceed to sublevel 3 for reassignment." And then the click. Elliot looked around. There was no map, no sign. But on the far wall behind the nurse's desk, a loose flap of wallpaper had curled back, revealing a metallic plaque beneath it. It read, "Stairwell 3, authorized staff only." With nothing else to do and nowhere else to go, Elliot pushed the door open. The stairwell smelled of bleach and burned plastic, a combination that made his skin feel thin. The walls were painted gray, but underneath the chipping paint he could see another color. Something yellowed and fleshy, like the shade of a once white bandage aged over decades. He descended slowly. Each step creaked, not from weight but from memory, like the steps were sighing as he passed. When he reached sublevel 3, the hallway had no lights. Only exit signs flickered weakly, casting an emergency red hue across everything. The air was colder here, and it hummed not with electricity, but with a strange kind of tension, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Elliot walked ahead. A wheelchair sat abandoned in the middle of the corridor, facing a blank wall. A clipboard rested on the seat. He picked it up. It was blank, except for one line, scrawled in red pen. "They don't forget you if you never leave." He dropped it. It didn't hit the floor. It just vanished. There was no sound, no impact. It was simply gone. He turned around and saw the hallway now had one more door than before. That door was slightly ajar. He had no memory of passing it. He approached. A light inside flickered. Room 3C, observation. As he entered, he saw dozens of monitors along the walls, each screen showing static. Then, slowly, the static faded and faces began to appear. Sleeping people. Dozens of them, men, women, children, some in hospital beds, some standing in corners, some staring directly at the camera, none moving, all still, except one. One monitor showed his room, room 29. The bed was made empty, but a figure stood beside it, too tall, slightly bent, breathing, but not humanly. As he stared, the figure slowly turned, but the screen went black before he could see its face. He stepped back instinctively and turned to leave the room, but the door had closed. Locked. The intercom on the wall next to the monitor crackled again. That same gravelly voice returned. "You've seen too much, Mr. Graves. It would be best if you rested now." The lights shut off. All at once, only the soft hum of the monitors remained, and in that hum, beneath the noise, was something else. A lullaby. Soft, broken, sung off-key by a voice that didn't remember what comfort meant. And Elliot, still standing, still listening, didn't notice that he had closed his eyes. Elliot Graves hadn't intended to return to the nurse's station, but his legs carried him there slowly, as if his own sense of direction had become absorbed by the building's will. The corridors were quieter now, somehow even more silent than before, and the air felt thick with old dust and thin memories that didn't belong to him. With each step, the flickering lights above cast long shadows that didn't match his movements, shadows that stayed still as he walked past them or stretched in the opposite direction. When he reached the desk again, he noticed something new. 6 manila folders, perfectly aligned, sitting on the counter in a fan shape, each labeled in tall black letters, Patient 1, Patient 2, and so on. But there were no names, no birth dates, no diagnosis codes, just the word observed, typed neatly on every cover. Elliot picked up the first folder and opened it slowly, expecting blank pages like everything else he'd seen. But inside were photographs, hundreds of them, each one showing the same hospital room from slightly different angles. A chair by the bed, an IV stand, a window with no view. And in every single photo, there was a patient lying in the bed, sometimes old, sometimes young, sometimes covered completely by sheets, sometimes barely visible. But the faces, they were all blurred. Not by motion, not by damage. They were deliberately obscured, smeared across the photo like wet paint dragged by invisible fingers. Elliot turned page after page, and the faces remained hidden. But one detail began to repeat. In each photo, just outside the hospital window, stood a tall figure in a long coat, unmoving, with its back always turned. As he flipped further, the figure appeared closer to the window, then closer, until one photo showed the figure inside the room, standing at the foot of the bed. The final photo in the folder showed an empty bed, the room in disarray, and a note left on the chair, "Do not file." Elliot closed the folder and set it down, his hands trembling slightly, though the rest of his body felt oddly relaxed, almost distant, like he was floating just above himself. The second folder contained a typed transcript, a conversation between a nurse and a patient. But the nurse's name was blacked out, and the patient's responses were incomplete, replaced with ellipses and long pauses. Lines like, "What do you remember before arriving?" followed by silence. "Do you know why you were transferred to sublevel 3? Again, silence. Then, toward the bottom of the page, the patient began to speak, slowly at first. "I heard them humming at night, always the same song, like a music box without a lid. And then later, they only walk when you look away, but even when you don't, they move differently." The final line was typed in bold, red ink. "He's not a doctor, he just wears the coat." Elliot didn't want to open the third folder, but his hands moved anyway, as if guided by something outside of his own will. Inside it was different. Only handwritten notes, scribbled chaotically on notepads, napkins, even torn pieces of surgical wrap. Messages layered over one another, written in what looked like dozens of different hands, but always in English, and always hurried. One page read, "They erased the floor plan. There were 6 wings, not 5. Another said, "Keep walking until the hallway forgets you're there." One note was burned around the edges but still legible. "Don't trust room 4D. It isn't a room anymore." Elliot turned the page, and the next note simply said, "You're being recorded." He looked up, slowly scanning the ceiling. There were no visible cameras, just sprinkler heads, long dead ceiling lights, and water stains shaped like watchful eyes. He opened the 4th folder. It was blank. Every page, 50 empty sheets of pristine paper. But as he turned to close it, the faint outline of words began to appear. Faint, like fogged-up glass, slowly drying. They formed one line at the top of the last page. "We write it for you when you forget." His breath caught for a moment, not in fear, but in a kind of gentle confusion, like trying to recall the details of a dream that slipped away the moment you opened your eyes. The 5th folder was heavier. As he opened it, he realized it was filled with cassette tapes, all numbered, all unmarked beyond that. No labels, no names. The one on top was labeled 17. He reached behind the desk and found, as if by design, an old tape player, already plugged in, already waiting. He pressed play. For the first 10 seconds, there was only silence. Then, breathing, Not panicked, not calm, just steady, soft breathing. Then footsteps. One, then another, echoing across tile. Then a voice. It was his voice. If you're hearing this, you're already here. Silence. Then, they told me I was admitted for evaluation, but I don't remember signing anything. Silence again. Then whispering, not from him, from others. Dozens of voices, too many to count, saying things too quietly to understand. Then, they file you by behavior, not by name. And then, static. The tape clicked off. Elliot didn't remember recording anything, but the voice was his, and the words were true. Somehow he knew it. He reached for the sixth and final folder with hesitation. Before he opened it, he noticed that this one had a seal across the flap. One of those old wax seals, red and cracked. He broke it, slowly. Inside was only a single photo, not of a room, not of a patient, of a mirror. And in the reflection stood Elliot, staring into it. But behind him, clear as day, stood a nurse in a gray uniform, watching him with eyes that were not human. They were far too dark, far too still, far too hollow. He turned around instinctively. No one was there. He looked at the photo again. Now he was alone in it. The nurse was gone. He closed the folder and suddenly realized the hallway had changed. It was no longer the same corridor. The walls were narrower, the lights above had shifted to a pale green hue, and at the far end, a new door appeared. A door with no handle, just a card slot blinking red. He didn't have a card. But as he took a step forward, the intercom beside the desk crackled to life again. That same automated voice returned, soft and emotionless. Mr. Graves. This concludes your preliminary review. Please proceed to the lower archive for final categorization. He didn't know where that was, but he felt that door was the way. And so, barefoot, tired, and somehow drifting deeper into something he couldn't name, Elliot walked toward the door that didn't open, but simply vanished when he arrived. And behind it, the darkness welcomed him, not with fear, but with a kind of familiarity. Like coming home to a place you never lived in, but remembered anyway. There was no sound as Elliot Graves crossed through the space where the door had been. No creak, no slam, no shift in air pressure, just a quiet flicker in his vision, like blinking during a film reel. And suddenly he was standing inside another corridor, one that felt not newly discovered but recently remembered, like something he'd known long ago and only just now recalled. Even though he had never seen this part of the hospital before. The walls here were smoother, untouched by the decay that had infected the rest of Briarwood, and the floor tiles were cleaner, almost polished, though they reflected nothing, not even the glow of the faint blue lights embedded into the ceiling every few feet, like constellations mapped to no known sky. There were no signs, no numbers, no directories, just a straight, quiet hallway lined with doors on either side, all closed, all without handles, each marked only with a small brass plate etched with a number and nothing more. He began walking, not because he felt a need to, but because the silence felt heavier when he stood still, like the air itself grew thicker the longer he paused, almost as if the hallway wanted him to keep moving. Room 414, room 416, then room 418, even numbers only. He paused at room 418 and stared at the brass plate for a moment longer than the others. Something about it tugged at him, not urgently, but familiarly. The way a smell might remind you of a place you visited in childhood, though you could never quite name it. Without meaning to, he placed his hand on the door. It felt warm. Not hot, not uncomfortable, just warm, like a forehead with a quiet fever. He closed his eyes, not sure why, and listened, but there was no sound inside. Just the soft hum of the corridor's unseen power, the gentle rhythmic throb of a system too old to still be working, and yet somehow fully operational. When he opened his eyes, the door was open, though he hadn't heard it move. The room inside was dim, lit only by a single lamp hanging from the ceiling by a frayed cord. There was a desk, a chair, and on the wall opposite the door, a mirror. Not like a bathroom mirror or a hallway mirror, but a large, rectangular panel of smoked glass that looked more like a one-way observation window than something meant for reflection. On the desk sat a stack of files. Again, no names, just numbers. But instead of folders, these were loose papers, stacked unevenly, many of them covered in handwritten notes and circled phrases. He moved closer. The chair felt recently used. The cushion still held the shape of someone who had been sitting there. He picked up the top page. Room 418. Unscheduled return noted. Subject appears unaware of prior occupancy. He blinked. Was that referring to him? He flipped to the next page. Memory disassociation stable. Subject responds to environmental cues without resistance. Lucid drift detected. The words felt clinical, cold, like notes taken during a study he hadn't agreed to be part of. The third page was blank. He flipped again, and again, dozens of blank sheets until the final one, which simply read, in uneven script, "You were never discharged." He set the pages down, heart quiet, breath steady, strangely calm. The mirror across the room caught his attention. It reflected the room accurately. Lamp, desk, wall, but not him. He wasn't in it. He moved, waved, stepped left and right. Nothing. The mirror remained still, reflecting a room with no person in it. As he stared, the reflection began to flicker, not all at once, but in waves, like light filtering through water, and shapes began to emerge on the other side. Hallways, desks, doors opening and closing slowly, people, maybe, or outlines of people, walking in slow, deliberate paths, heads down, arms loose at their sides. He stepped closer, just a foot away now, and noticed that the figures weren't moving randomly. They were walking in circles, repeating the same loop over and over again. And among them, one stood out, a taller man in a patient gown, barefoot, eyes open too wide, mouth moving slowly as if whispering to himself. The man looked up, looked toward Elliot, and smiled. It was Elliot, or someone who looked exactly like him, but not just a mere version. This one had different eyes, darker, fuller, as if filled with something more permanent. The mirrored Elliot turned and walked away, vanishing into the fog of that other side, and the mirror faded to black again. Elliot turned from it, walked out of the room, and found the hallway had changed again. It was longer now. No doors, just a single elevator at the far end, its display screen glowing green with the number 5 flashing steadily as if waiting for a call. He approached it slowly, pressed the button. No sound. But the doors opened. Inside, the elevator was covered in soft white padding, walls, floor, even the ceiling, and it smelled faintly of antiseptic and old blankets. There were no floor buttons. Only one, lower archives. He pressed it. The elevator began to move, but not downward in the normal way. Not a mechanical drop, no cables shifting, no pull of gravity, just a slow drift, as if falling gently through water. The lights dimmed as it moved. After an eternity, or a moment, it stopped, and the doors opened to reveal a hallway lined with filing cabinets. Thousands of them, row upon row, stretching into the dark. A sign above read, "Pending classification." As he stepped out, a motion light flickered on above him, and a mechanical arm dropped from the ceiling, extending a card with his name printed on it. Graves, Elliot, unknown class, pending review. The card inserted itself into a slot on a nearby cabinet, which opened with a soft hiss. Inside was nothing but a chair and a screen. The screen turned on. Static. Then a face. Not his. An old man, maybe in his 70s, wearing a hospital gown, eyes glassy, voice weak. "They let me out once, but I kept dreaming of the walls, so I came back." Static. Another face. A nurse, maybe. "They say we're all observations now. No discharges, just delays." Static. The screen flickered faster. Dozens of faces, whispering. "I saw him once. He doesn't blink. The doors move when you sleep. There's another floor below this, we're not allowed to know." Elliot stepped back. The screen shut off. The filing cabinet closed, and a light turned on above a new hallway. A sign above read, "Integration Wing." He walked toward it, not thinking, not resisting. The walls were white here, clean, peaceful. He could hear faint music playing, a piano, soft and slow, repeating a melody that seemed familiar, though he couldn't name it. The hallway ended in a wide circular room filled with beds, dozens of them, all empty. Each bed had a nameplate. Elliot checked one, then another, then another. His name was on all of them. Different ID numbers, different timestamps. Same name, same patient, same silence. He turned to leave, but the door was gone, replaced by a mirror, and this time the mirror showed the room exactly as it was, with him, standing alone in the center. But slowly behind him, the beds began to fill, one by one, shapes forming beneath the blankets, figures turning their heads, eyes opening, not blinking, not moving, just watching. And as he stared, the reflection smiled. Not him, the mirror. The mirror itself smiled. There was no announcement, no footsteps behind him, no unlocking of doors or flicker of light, just the sudden awareness, as if it had always been true, that Elliot Graves had been moved again, not by his own action, not by choice, but by the slow gravity of the place that seemed to drift reality like dust in a sunbeam. And now he found himself in a room unlike any other, one without doors or walls or even a ceiling he could see, though he could feel the smoothness of the ground beneath his bare feet and the soft, distant hum that had followed him since the first night, now louder but not oppressive, more like breathing, more like the exhale of an endless hallway somewhere far beneath where any map could lead. There were no windows, and yet there was light, a soft ambient glow that came from nowhere in particular and everywhere all at once. In the center of the room stood a single hospital bed. Too clean, too perfect, like a set piece in a play that never had an audience. Beside it, a clipboard floated, literally suspended in the air, as if held by invisible strings or by memory itself. And as Elliot stepped closer, the clipboard tilted slightly toward him, inviting, like an old friend showing him something he already knew but had forgotten to notice. The paper on the board was aged but smooth, unmarked except for a single sentence written in evenly spaced type. "This room has no time. Please stay until remembered." He didn't understand the sentence, and yet he did. Not intellectually, not emotionally, but with a deeper part of him. The part that no longer questioned where he was or how long he had been here. The part that had stopped counting footsteps, or worrying about exits, or listening for sounds that never came. He sat down on the edge of the bed. It gave way beneath him with a softness that felt like cotton soaked in silence. The longer he sat, the less weight he seemed to have, as if he was becoming part of the room, like furniture, like the quiet itself. The ceiling, or what passed for it, began to shimmer faintly, like a projection screen left running without content. Slowly shapes emerged. Circles, diagrams, not images but medical symbols, perhaps, or renderings of brainwaves or dream cycles, cycling over and over again in infinite loops, feeding back into themselves. Looping not forward or backward, but inward, as though each pattern folded into the previous one. The walls began to hum gently, as if remembering something too large to express in sound. And from behind him, without turning, he sensed movement. Not a person, not a creature, just presence. Something large and neutral. Something like an idea that had grown too real to remain invisible. A voice, neither male nor female, neither electronic nor natural, filled the space. Not from any source, but from the space itself. It said simply, "Integration complete." Then, silence again. Elliot lay back onto the bed, not because he was tired, but because there was nothing else for him to do. There was no urge to leave, no path to follow, only the bed, only the air. Only the sense that wherever he had been, whatever he had thought himself to be, had been gradually shed like old clothing, left behind in each room, each hallway, each flickering reflection. He tried to think of his name, but the letters came apart before they formed, as if even language was no longer a structure he belonged to. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to allow the room to continue. In his mind, he saw the hospital now not as a building, but as a system, a breathing archive, a dreaming machine, collecting not people, but the echoes of people, their decisions, their hesitations, their dreams abandoned mid-thought and recycled into walls and clocks and empty beds. He saw his own face, not in a mirror, but inside another file, stamped with words he no longer needed to read. And as he faded further into the stillness, he became aware that others were nearby. Not visible, not whispering, just near, resting, remembering, or perhaps forgetting. A small light blinked above the bed, soft, blue, steady, and beside him the clipboard updated itself. A new sentence now. Subject has reached administrative stillness. Archive complete. He breathed in, or thought he did, though breath was no longer a sound or motion, just a faint awareness of self. Somewhere, distant but familiar, the intercom clicked on, played one last lullaby in a tune he had never learned but somehow could hum in his mind, and then went quiet forever. The room dimmed, but not to darkness, just to nothingness. And in that stillness, time flattened like paper left in rain, and memory settled into the walls like dust, waiting to be stirred again by whoever arrived next, asking nothing, seeking nothing, just following the quiet. And Briarwood remained, not haunted, not cursed, but simply occupied by the ones who were never really discharged. Only filed, only observed, only kept like sleep that never quite ended,